Welcome to the Writers Talk, the podcast where writers talk about writing and writers. I'm Christopher from Writers Write, and my co-host today is
Oliver Fox.
And welcome to a new year, 2021. I'm sure everyone is glad that 2020 is over. And we're hoping that this will be a successful year for everyone in terms of writing. So we thought that perhaps we could do a method of getting a novel done in just under a year. And that could be a good New Year's resolution for any writer who's aspiring to write a book.
Absolutely.
And so today we're going to give you a few resources, things to help you get into the groove of writing, perhaps ways to build up that writing muscle if you just beginning, and a few other bits of advice here and there that we think are relevant about the writing process.
Excellent.
So where should we begin?
It's a huge subject, and one that is very often, I mean, let's be honest, writers are notorious. Of all the different types of artists and craftspeople, by far the most notorious for not getting things done, for procrastinating and for missing deadlines, things of that nature. So it's clearly...
Yes, yeah. Hanging out in coffee shops, telling people about their manuscript or their script
right.
or something, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we are... it is almost like a joke that at this point. I mean, it really is a joke. Just how undependable we can be when it comes to creating a writing habit. And there seems to be two poles, two philosophies that I've seen that pull very hard one direction or the other. And one of them seems to be this very almost mystical sort of perception that, you know, you write when the muse has inspired you, when you've been struck by that inspiration, and that's the only pure and true time to write. And you just kind of wait around until then, and daydream.
Yes, yeah. You'll suddenly wake up one day with all the energy to pump out a novel in a few weeks.
Exactly.
That's the idea. I kind of wonder if that comes from sort of like manic depression.
Yeah, I mean,
where a lot of writers probably do have some problems, and you know, some do, they feel better than others.
You know, that's a fascinating theory, because I could absolutely see it coming from that. I do know a dear friend of mine is a writer who does have manic depression, and that tends to be the way that that he works, is in fits and starts. And he is absolutely brilliant, but it's, you know, when he's in a depressive state, he won't write for sometimes years, and then he'll have an extremely productive period where he'll write manuscript worth of work, of prose, but of course it's all just little snatches, just bits and pieces of stories. None of it is ever a full, complete narrative. And so as a result, he's never published anything.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it's a problem if it is a real problem for you, and we're probably not people to you know, solve that problem. But I think it's important for everyone just to get into some sort of groove and habit that you can set in stone, and just get yourself writing every day. So I would like to compare it to, so I mean, during the sort of quarantine period that's going on, which has been going on for longer than I think anyone could imagine. I decided to start a language, right?
Okay.
And
what are you studying?
I'm studying Japanese, which is
nice.
Something I started in high school, but just sort of dropped off. So I decided to pick it up again. And but I decided to go about it in a very systematic way,
Excellent.
where I'll make flashcards using a
Hmm.
electronic flashcard device, and I'll make a sentence. I'll maybe record a bit of actual Japanese audio, get a picture or something with a word that I'm trying to learn, and then I'll learn 10 of them a day or something like that.
Right.
And then this program will remind me to review them the next day or whenever it's appropriate to review them again. And so what that's done over, I mean, I've been doing it all year, all of last year, and I have found it was incredibly painful for the first about 45 days.
Yeah.
But I think there's quite a bit of anxiety now in me if I stop doing it. I'll feel like
Right.
something's wrong because there's a
Yeah.
rhythm to my day, and
Interesting.
it is just dedicated to that particular activity. And
Yeah.
you should try do that for writing, and I think it's perfectly
Hmm.
achievable as well. But and in very different ways, obviously.
Right.
So I think the workmanlike, opposed to waiting for Clio to descend from Olympus and tell you what to write,
It's much more reliable anyway.
much more reliable way than doing just waiting for inspiration to strike.
Yeah.
So
No,
so
there's.
how do we go about doing that, right? And I've got a couple of examples of writers who
Okay.
write about that process. I think the most famous one is Stephen King.
Yeah.
And King wrote On Writing, which is maybe the book every writer should read. Even if you don't like his genre or the way he writes, he gets a tremendous amount of writing done.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
I think
Uh,
it will benefit anyone who wants to be a writer to read that book.
yes. I ran the numbers once just to jump in real quick to add a little tidbit of just how productive he is. He writes 1.75 books a year, which is astonishing. And actually, recently his rate has gone up. He's closer to 2 books a year.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I mean it's incredible. And I mean it's not even as fast as he's ever been necessarily.
no,
So, some years he's uh, early in his life, late teens, early 20s, he was
yeah,
just pumping out as many books as he could because he wasn't getting published. So
right,
he had a lot more time to try and get something to stick with the publisher.
right.
Um, but he writes every morning,
Hmm.
not incredibly early. I don't think he's a incredibly early riser or anything like that, but until 12 o'clock in the morning
Okay,
as his full-time job until he reaches a word count of 1,000 words, I believe.
okay.
And
Definitely challenging, but also very reasonable.
yeah, what's that? 3.5 pages, right?
Right.
More or less.
Yeah.
So he does that, and then he stops, and he goes about the rest of his day, and does various family things or other obligations. And he does that for 3 months, more or less, until he ends up with a 80,000 page book,
Right.
or however long the book he is writing is going to be. But let's say an average book is about 80,000
Yeah.
words. And then he begins the editing process at the
Hmm.
same speed. Or maybe a bit faster because, I mean, obviously you're not necessarily producing words at that point. But for the same amount of time every day, he'll edit until he reaches his goal for that day, which I think he says takes another month, maybe a month and a half. And then it's time for him to get feedback. So
Right.
that's the time he sets aside to produce a novel until the stage he's
Wow.
happy to show it to another person too.
So all told, it's around 4 months.
Probably close to 5, I would say. So
Five. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's still astonishing to imagine. I mean, for a lot of people, to imagine putting not just putting down 80,000 words, but to to also revise that heavily enough that you could really show it to somebody within that time period.
Yeah, but it's very achievable. It's not like
Yes, absolutely.
it's not like it's killing him. He doesn't.
No,
He's not stressed about it. It's not onerous on his life or anything like that. But he is a full-time writer,
right.
and I think a lot of people don't have 5 or 6 hours in the morning to dedicate
Right.
solely to writing. I don't know what your feeling about that is, Oliver.
Yeah. So I think have I told the story about a mentor of mine when I was asking him to, see if we could meet up and get together, and his response, I may have already, I don't want to repeat myself if I've already shared that anecdote.
Well, no, I don't remember. So probably,
Okay.
probably good.
So essentially, I had an old mentor friend a while ago, who, one day we ran into each other. We hadn't seen each other in a few years, and very excited to see him, and said, well, I'd love to get together. Like, let's, this was obviously before the pandemic, but let's, go grab some coffee at some point. Do you have any time? And he kind of smiled sadly at me. He said, I'll be honest, I have no time. I've got, 3 kids now. I've got a wife. I've working 2 jobs. I'm absolutely booked up. I don't have any time for you. And I was understanding as best I could be, but I was also a little crestfallen to hear the words, I don't have time for you. But then he paused and he said, but you know what? I care about you. You are a priority, so I will make time for you. And that's been something that has always kind of stuck with me, is that we make time for the things and for the people that matter to us. Very, very rarely does anyone have time for the things that they really would like to do. But if they do prioritize it, they can make time for it. So, one of the ways that I do that, and this is not something a lot of people are going to want to hear, because I am one of those weirdos. You were saying that King gets up at a reasonable hour, but I'm getting my my MFA right now, and I'm working, and
yeah, you're on the rock schedule, right?
Yeah, it's pretty. It can be a lot sometimes. But the way that I've done it, so 2 years ago, I was working 60-hour weeks and then doing graduate school for a season. And I was also taking 3 classes, which is 2 is good when it comes to at least the program that I'm in. 3, my teachers start to look at me like I'm a little crazy. So all that together, I shouldn't have been able to do it all, but the way that I was able to prioritize it and make it work was to get up early. For me, that was 4:30. I don't expect most people to do that, but sometimes just a few hours in the morning, just like King is saying. And then as soon as I got back from work, no matter how tired I was, kind of like what you were describing with your your language studies, I had a few hours before I settled in for dinner that I would work, and it was just this this pattern, this flow, to where if I didn't fall into that routine, something felt off to me, and it was primarily because I knew that I was going to get way behind in my work, but it was just required doing what was necessary and treating it like, this is my job, which, in a way, school kind of is your job. It's definitely got
I'm sure it is. It should be your sole occupation of a
right.
student, really. And
right.
when you have another job as well, it becomes much more difficult, I imagine.
Right. So all that to say, essentially, when I treated the times that I've treated writing as a hobby, it has remained sort of a hobby schedule. But when I've treated it as a job, I have been much more productive, and I've I've been able to achieve various things.
And there are some examples of authors who have gone about these sort of early rising routine.
Yeah.
I wish I could remember. There was an English author who he worked as an accountant, but he'd wake up at maybe not 4:30, but 5, and then he'd write for 2.5 hours, and then hop on the train and go to work.
Yeah.
And he produced something like 6 full published works while doing that. So it's perfectly achievable.
Yeah.
A lot of people think writing right early in the morning is maybe also one of the better times to get good writing done. But that'll depend on you as a person and how your brain functions. So Mia, one of our contributors, she's written the prompts for 2021, and she's collated into a workbook in 12 chapters, and she gives advice at the beginning of each chapter. And one of the bits of advice was, since she had children, she had to completely adjust her schedule.
Right.
She used to write in the evenings,
right,
until quite early in the morning. That was her preferred schedule. But like with getting kids to school, she's had to adjust that to, I think, just when she gets back from doing that. So she'll wake up 6 o'clock, get the kids to school by 7, I guess. And then at 8 o'clock, she'll set aside an hour for writing every day. And that is her dedicated everyday session that she has to just write in. And it's in her, by her admission, not ideal. I mean, she obviously preferred to do what was working best for her. But if you're in a situation that is less than ideal, you have to make do. And I think it's a good compromise.
Absolutely. No, I mean, the writers I know who are most successful tend to be the ones who are also the most adaptable. I know a writer who has recently, he's taken over a major, he got a publishing deal with Simon & Schuster and has taken over writing for one of the Bourne series, the Robert Ludlum books. And so he's doing quite well. But he worked as a SWAT team member, which I don't know if do you have that same terminology to refer to?
Everyone knows SWAT, right? I'm sure,
okay.
Even if there's not such a thing in other countries.
Yeah. So he's somebody who's daily in danger. When he is called to a job, it's his life is on the line. Before that, he was a special ops sort of person. But he talked about how it took him years to write his first book, and then when he started shopping it around, everybody kind of balked. They just laughed at him kind of outright. And finally, he decided to seek out somebody who could help him kind of refine it. Got that done. Long and short, he got into a regular writing practice where he was producing 90,000 words every 3 to 4 months. And he kind of, he did get a book deal with Simon & Schuster, and he was eventually published. Now that required a great deal of editing for that first book. He said it was virtually a different book. And it took a whole another 2 years to get that book to a workable state. But in that time, he developed the habit of producing just enormous amounts of work. And a lot of it he credited to getting up in the morning very early, which he already had to do for his job, and just writing furiously. And then as soon as he got back home, writing furiously. And this is someone who was kind of mocked for that, because being bookish, I guess, in police was sort of frowned on, at least in the town he's in. But now he's at a point where he not only has he taken over a franchise for somebody else, but he's actually so famous for being prolific that he has been assigned to take over many other sort of ghostwriting positions for authors who have, sort of a stable of other authors who write under their name. But he's been, that's really where his bread and butter is. I mean, he does write his own books on top of that, which is astonishing. So he writes his own books. He writes this one series for the Bourne Identity, or the Bourne series, and then he's also writing for all these other authors. And I mean, he went from spending years writing one novel to 10 years later, and now he's last time I checked in with him, he said he produces about 120,000 words every 3 months. Now, I mean, obviously he's grown to be astonishingly capable, but the way that he describes it, it was a practice, it was a craft, it was not something he was naturally good at.
And you would have to build yourself up to that point, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so what I would say is, don't jump into the book.
Oh no.
I think you need to sort of work on your writing first.
Right? Yes, absolutely.
So I mean, we've got a thing you can do on the website, or you can download the book if you want, called Hooked on Writing: 31 Days to a Writing Habit, and it's 31 writing exercises, one for each day of the month, that get you to build that habit. Like I was describing, that sort of language learning habit, where by the end of it, you'll feel bad about not writing every day. And that's the desirable state to be in, right?
Yeah.
Where you notice something's wrong, and exactly, yeah. I mean, that's how you're productive, I suppose. Feel bad about not doing something. But anyway, it gets you to that point where there's a sort of, I don't know, almost like a dopamine reward for having done your daily writing.
Yeah.
And if you want to be a writer and you want to do it as a career, I mean, being rewarded for your work is a great state to be in.
Absolutely.
So I would suggest having a look at that, or instituting something similar to that yourself. And then from that point, I'd continue to do the daily writing every day, maybe with a bit more focus on producing something like a novel,
right,
or short stories, or whatever it is that you're hoping to achieve. But I think you need to start plotting then, before you actually sit down and set out to write a 300, 400 word, 300, 400 page book. Otherwise, you're not going to get it done in a year. And it just reminds me of a conversation between Stephen King and George R.R. Martin, on stage giving a sort of interview. And R.R. Martin looks at King and just goes, "How do you write so goddamn much?"
Yeah.
And King gives him this kind of like, I just write every day.
Right.
And obviously Martin is not of that mindset, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, and
when you compare like book counts, something like 40 or 50 to 7 or 8,
right,
you see the difference in productivity that someone with an addiction to writing has.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, so another good example would be Patrick Rothfuss and Brandon Sanderson. Patrick Rothfuss is absolutely an inspiration writer. And so, I mean, he's produced 2 or 3 books, I think. And he and Brandon Sanderson both kind of came out around the same time. In that same time, Brandon Sanderson has produced around 25 books, which is, by the way, I mean, I ran the numbers on him as well, and on average, he does about 2.5 books a year, which is even more productive than King, which is absolutely astonishing. And if you want to talk about
considering the length of Brandon Sanderson's books, it's probably more impressive as well.
Yeah, and if you also consider the fact that he he's not somebody who is a full-time writer in the sense that King is, where King is, I imagine, has a little bit more of a leisurely life. Other than that, Sanderson is a teacher as well. I mean, he is. You can take his classes online for free. He posts them every year. It's fantastic, which I highly recommend on YouTube. But he's teaching and grading papers and jet setting all over the world to do book tours. And, I mean, he's working very, very hard on top of, in other areas of his life, on top of producing this massive amounts of extremely successful work. And I just want to clarify, I'm not saying this to poo-poo Rothfuss or Martin by any stretch of the imagination. They are two of the most influential and recognizable writers in fantasy and science fiction, speculative fiction in general. But they do seem to have a method that doesn't serve them as well as those who are more habitual writers, right? So it's succeeded in spite of that.
I do think it helps if you have a career that is basically writing to begin with, and so you can't help but practice all the time.
Yeah.
Particularly something where you read a lot. As another successful writer, Terry Pratchett, he was first a journalist, and then I think he was a publicist for a nuclear power station. But I mean, that's
right.
Anyway, both were concerned with him just writing press releases and articles and doing that all day. And during that time, I think it was a good long time, maybe almost a decade he did that before he became a full-time writer.
Yeah.
But he had, a book a year almost the entire time. None of them were very few of them were the ones he's well known for now.
Right.
But because he was learning, first as a journalist, to just produce text at an incredible rate, that's where he got his writing habit from. And
absolutely
internalized the sort of editors' critiques of lazy writing, overly flowery language. Everything became much more neat, much more orderly, and much more workmanlike in that sense. And then having to communicate to the public, he had to learn how to simplify concepts
right
at the same time. So you're not going to have that as a person who is, I don't know, a carpenter or someone who just has a normal office job, unless it is something that has to do with writing. So you have to artificially create those circumstances.
Absolutely.
And to do that will be some work, I think.
Absolutely. So I think that's honestly the biggest benefit, the biggest reason in favor of writing programs is not necessarily the instruction, but more the idea of you're kind of paying people to put a gun to your head and give you deadlines. And
just to comment on that, Mia's website is called Deadlines for Writers, right?
Yeah, there you go.
So, I mean, a thing for this year is 52 scenes. So a scene a week, 1,500 words scene a week. So that's your deadline every week, to get at least a scene done. That's not going to give you a novel in a year, though.
No.
Because a novel is about 120 scenes, 60 scenes, and then sequels to those scenes.
Right.
So if you're aiming for a novel, you have to double that deadline there.
Yeah.
But a scene every 4 days doesn't sound as good, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, and it does sound intimidating, but it is one of those things where you kind of, just like building a workout routine for anyone who may have experience with that. If even if you're not a particularly athletic person, or you're just frankly not interested in it, just building up that tolerance, getting through the soreness of those first 2 weeks of working out is really what can kind of build your confidence to do longer and harder workouts. And you know, the more that you can do those longer and harder workouts, the better results you can often get. And it functions much the same way with writing. Is, you know, it's more often than not, you're starting out, one page in a day will feel fantastic, 250 words. And that should feel fantastic because that's your current threshold. But, you know, as you go along, a good sign of progression is that you can produce larger and larger word counts in a shorter period of time. And it may be a great deal of it that you will have to cut. And that is one thing that I'd like to let a lot of folks know is, at least in my own experience, you know, in workshops, 40% of my initial draft is going to be completely removed. And that's sometimes, if it's a longer story, that, you know, that can feel devastating. You know, those hours that you devoted to this thing.
Oh yeah, no, that's just how it works. I mean, half the articles I've written never get published. I've got several books on hard drives that will never see the light of day. But you just have to keep writing, and then you have to edit it down into something that is readable.
Yeah,
because that amazing idea you have for a story might be amazing, but you have to put it into the structure of a story, and then revise it until it's an interesting story.
Right.
And otherwise, it's just an abstract. It's just a long, boring abstract. It's just a description of events.
Yeah, exactly.
That's no value to anyone, really, except maybe a sort of historian, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's kind of what a lot of early drafts of stories that I've read from young writers are. It's almost like a history or a summary of the story that they want to write. I see that all the time as, you know, people pitching me or they'll send me, you know, because I do one of my side gigs is as a novel analyst for.
So yeah, they'll send you the manuscript or 3,000 words of something.
And it's, most of it is not actually storytelling per se. It is more of a history of a world or a land, because a lot of them I'm reading fantasy and sci-fi, and you know, I'll be like, wow, this is a fantastic concept or premise, or a combination of the two if they've fully developed it. What's the story? And they say, well, that is the story. So, well, no, it's not a story yet because nobody's doing anything. I mean, there's lots of things happening, but nobody's moving anywhere. They're not pursuing any specific goal.
Yeah, I mean, it's, if you talk about something like Star Trek, right? I mean, the story is not that people are on starships going here and there and finding aliens. Yeah. That's just the premise of the story, premise of the show. The story is the characters and the interactions they have and the conflict.
Right.
And exactly. That's often just absent in the early draft of a novel.
Right.
And people, what they do, they confuse the plot and the story.
Right.
What they should be doing is making that outline, but they shouldn't be sending it to you and asking you what's wrong with this. That's obviously not the final bit of work, right? That's just their idea. From that, I think what you should do is you should work on that idea. Let's give it a time frame. So build your habit for a month.
Yeah.
Work on your story. What, say another month? Is that fair? I'd say that's fair. You should end up with a good chunk of change in terms of words, and then critically look at it and determine what you can manipulate in that cauldron of ideas into a product that other people would be interested and engaged with in the reading process.
Absolutely. No, and I think that's one thing that I'd like to circle back to about my friend who ended up, taking over working as a ghostwriter and writing for larger established franchises. His the thing that got him to finally be able to get his first manuscript, his first book into working order was exactly what you say. He found an editor, actually one of Stephen King's editors, who now is a freelancer who worked on the Dark Tower series, and he said, you know, he paid a pretty penny, I will say that. But essentially, this guy markets himself as a story doctor and just taught him the fundamentals of storytelling, of learning how to plot a story, how to outline a story. And it was only once he had learned those structures to the point where it was almost like muscle memory that he was able to produce these massive manuscripts so quickly. Whereas before it had taken him, 3 or 4 years to write a single 80,000, 90,000 word manuscript. Now he's doing that in, a quarter of a year. And but he knew what were the structural and technical requirements of what made something a story.
I think it's super useful going to an editor. They are expensive though. I mean, I've paid for one to edit a manuscript before, and it's not cheap. But it's also very disheartening to get back all the feedback, and then know you have to rewrite basically pages and pages, not 60% of the draft into something more workable. But that sort of kick in the pants can be motivating, or can stop you entirely from writing. You'll find out which kind of person you are.
And really what I'm not necessarily advocating going to find a freelance editor, or, drop a bunch of money, or because you're absolutely right. That can be, and honestly, in the time that I've worked as an analyst, which is basically
similar field, right?
What's that?
It's a similar job.
Yeah, it's a similar job. It's just content edits. It's not. It's very rare that I'm going to be looking at the prose itself.
Yeah.
I mean, I may have if somebody has a persistent habit of, turning their nouns into verbs, then I may mention something like that. But primarily, I'm focusing on communicating the content of the story, and structuring that as effectively as possible. And unfortunately, many writers are just devastated because they realize they don't know their craft. They have just sat down and spit out, as much prose as they could, without any kind of discipline.
Or any well thought out structural goal.
Yeah. And so that will be very, very disheartening for a lot of people. So what I want to clarify is I'm advocating for learning your craft, getting in the habit of producing work, and then once you have that discipline and you have the knowledge, then it's time to get to work. It would be like
but it's important that you learn your craft, you have the developed discipline, and then you output, right?
Right.
Exactly. So, I mean, you can develop the discipline and then go directly to the writing process, but you're going to end up with a lot of words, none of which are publishable.
Right. Exactly.
So,
and then at that point, like you were saying, anybody you show it to is going to be their feedback will be disheartening.
And if it's a lot of words, and it's a friend or something helping you out, they're not going to look at you favorably if you give them an 80,000 word draft of something. I think three chapters. It's the perfect amount to give to someone, right?
Yeah. No, that's a good solid. I mean, if you can, and I mean honestly, one chapter should be enough to. If you give somebody a chapter, and they are not asking you, if they're not begging you for the next two, that's not a great sign.
Yeah.
And so you do have to learn that craft of how to hook people in and make them want to ask, that essential question of what's going to happen next.
Okay. So our process is develop a habit. Maybe in that after you've developed the habit, then go look into some courses and materials and instruction.
Learn your craft.
Learn your craft. There's plenty of that on writerswrite.co.za. You can have a look around. I'll recommend a few articles and courses at the end. Once you've done that, maybe then it's time to plot. So that can be your beginning of the year, right? Your January, February, March.
Right.
And by that time, you would have figured out if you need more time in any of those processes.
Yes.
I think particularly people who have been failed by the education system might need more time in one of those areas. Sure. And you'll only know once you've got there. It's impossible to know how good or bad you are at something until you've done it for a while.
Yeah.
Sort of, almost the Dunning-Kruger effect of writing. You won't know how bad you are as a writer until you've done it for a while and been criticized by other people. Then you'll be able to see how much more writing you need to get done to get to a level where you're happy enough to publish a story. That's your first third of the year, I would say. And if you're a really good writer already, maybe you just jump into writing your plot and planning out that plot. So how do we go about the planning process? The way would you start, Oliver?
So I actually have a lot of thoughts on this particular subject because at least in the writing workshops I've been in, which I've been in quite a few by this point, I'm going on a decade of academia studying writing formally with my BFA and now my MFA. And then a gap of a number of years in between where I was, working at journals and stuff of that nature. But so plotting is one of those things a lot of people are resistant to. So I think the first thing to discuss is helping people get over some hangups about what plotting is and what it can help you do.
I just like to say it's going to save you time and energy and make your product better. A lot of people sort of believe it takes away from the magical process of writing, but if you honestly believe that, nothing we've said here will affect you in any way, and you might as well go off and do your thing, because no one's going to be able to tell you otherwise. And this doesn't work. Authors who think it work have just written through that process long enough and been rejected enough times to have developed it by themselves. Unconsciously. Right. Or they've edited their book 6, 7, 8, 9 times until it's in a decent state to be published. Save yourself all that effort and all that time. Or rather, like 3 books, I think 1 book 6 times.
Right, exactly. And that's really all it is it's working out the kinks on the front end. And for the people who are afraid, there's that quote that I think has been a scourge to a lot of writers, whether they realize it or not. Writing is like driving at night with only your headlights. You can only see a few yards ahead of you, but that's all you need to make the journey. One of the things that they think that essentially that's applied to plotting. They say, oh, you don't need to have an outline. You don't need a plot. You can just write, what you have in your brain right now, and the rest of the road will reveal itself as it goes. And part of the problem of that metaphor is what they're not talking about is if you're driving at night, you have a destination in mind, right? You're going somewhere, and you have a limited resource of gas in order to get there. And you need to know where your stops are in order to not run out of gas. And that's essentially what an outline is it's a roadmap where you have planned stops, you have planned areas, rest stops where I have to get here in order to gas back up and get back on the road. But no matter how meticulously planned, so I am a meticulous plotter. I have outlines that would probably look like some sort of just absurd equation to a lot of people. And yet, when I submit things to workshops, I've never been accused of being formulaic. I've been accused of many other things, but not that. And it's because it is invisible, and it's a natural structure that reflects the way that the human brain works, plot and story structure. It's not an artificial thing, which I think a lot of people are afraid of. But really, all a plot is a model of how the human brain processes an event.
A story, yeah.
Yeah. But on top of that, I've found that just like a well planned out journey, just knowing where the rest stops are is not going to ruin the excitement of the trip. There's going to be unforeseen circumstances. There are going to be things that crop up unexpectedly. And I've always found, no matter how meticulous my outline is, no matter how meticulous my plot is, things happen that surprise me. There's never been a time where I haven't been surprised by how the
yes, no,
plot.
and that's the problem, right? Authors always say in the speeches they give, at events that they never saw that character doing that, or that character did that all by themselves, right? And then the poor people in the audience think, oh, they've not planned any of this. They've just invented this magical, wonderful story that I love so much, and it just came to them as they went. But they were just surprised at how that character fit into their plot. They didn't see that particular character doing that at that point, but they either adjusted the plot to work, at that time,
Yes.
or it worked as part of that plot at that time. They just weren't entirely certain of how they were going to achieve that particular goal.
Right.
It might be surprising who the love interest turned out to be to them, or who died, or how they got to that goal of saving the world, or the character's resolution or something like that. But they probably had some idea of what that resolution was going to be from the beginning of the book, because that is the idea of the book, right?
Yes.
It's very rarely, I think sometimes it happens with TV series, but very rarely that you just have an idea for a world.
Right.
Mostly what authors have is the idea for the end of a book, right?
Yes.
That tends to be what comes to me when I want to write something. So, that would be a great way to end a book. And then I have to work backwards to try and find out, where would the beginning of this book be? Where's the middle of this book? And how should I get to that point? But if you are then sort of taking that idea you have and turning it into just the concept of the world, you're kind of turning the end of the book into the beginning. In my estimation, right?
Yes.
And then there's nowhere to go from there. It's driving in the night into a roadblock that you can't get past. Because you've started at the end, and there's no road left.
Right. It's maddening to try and help this click for people. I can't tell you how many times I've tried to explain it, because it is so often belittled as a lack of creativity to outline or plot it. But I mean, honestly, would you trust an architect who didn't know, they didn't have the blueprints for the building? No,
you wouldn't. And just to give a literary example, there's a book called The Man in the High Castle, by
Philip K. Dick, right?
Yeah, right, correct. And I really like the way it's written. I like the concept of the world. It's sort of like this alternative history, right, where Japan and Germany won World War II and divided America in half, I think, right? Yeah, and he's got this wonderful way of describing various characters and how people see the world. But that sort of, he starts at that point, And then it sort of goes in this convoluted, unsatisfactory kind of way where it reaches a conclusion of sorts, but a very disappointing one. Because I feel he started with the end of his story.
Yeah.
He had this wonderful idea for a world. And he had no way of really figuring that out. By the way, this has very little to do with the series, I think, TV series. They're very different books. So it just sort of peters out, and as many unfortunately many science fiction works tend to do. And this is what you want to avoid. You want to avoid disappointing your reader, because that's not a reader that's coming back for your next book, generally speaking, even if they really enjoyed the concept that you created.
And one of the ways that I've heard to remedy this, that, I mean, it sounds so simple, but that's really kind of revolutionized it for me, understanding plot and story, is treating a story as a question. And actually this was Brandon Sanderson. I know that he's at least one of the authors who I've heard espouse this method. But he actually surprisingly doesn't tout himself as a particularly meticulous plotter, which you would expect given how vast and well-developed.
He does workshop his ideas every week, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. I mean, he is absolutely a plotter, but he's not to the scale and level of meticulousness that many people would expect him to be. And on the flip side, the kind of the person that people raise as the patron saint of gardening, pantsing, George R.R. Martin, is actually, in fact, a plotter. If you read his description of his own process, he works out the ending, and then he figures out the key events ahead of time. He makes sure that he has all the relevant characters. The only thing that he has in common with pantsers is that he only writes those things when he's inspired. But he is, in fact, what he would term an architect, which is just kind of ironic. Yeah. But Sanderson advocates for treating a story like a series of dramatic questions with one particular overarching dramatic question. And essentially, you open a story by creating that dramatic in the question in the reader's mind. Will the character accomplish such and such goal, or will they fail in some spectacular way? And it needs to be a question that creates, that's clearly visible in the mind of the reader, right? So that way you have, and it creates a push and pull. So there's two major questions. One that drives the story forward by pushing from behind, and the other one that pulls the story forward. And essentially, you have those two forces, pushing and pulling. The question, one of them is essentially, will the character achieve their dream come true? Will they accomplish the goal that they think will make them finally happy? And again, it has to be something palpable, something tangible. Or instead, will they be overtaken by the event that they would consider to be an absolute nightmare, the thing that would ruin their lives? And
I mean, that's something that you do need, and it should be contained in that plotting section, right?
Yes, but just reducing it to those simple of terms can open it up a lot more and make it greatly simplify the process.
Yeah, but if scene and sequel, right? You need the action and then the reaction to it, basically. Right. Exactly. And there should be more actions than reactions in a book, typically. Yes. That doesn't mean you mustn't resolve everything, but resolving something is often much simpler than actually starting the process. So you can often resolve two things with one sequel. Right. Or characters coming together to resolve things together. That's obviously how books with thread lines work. Right. So typically, there might be 60 scenes and 45 sequels. Sometimes they can be an even amount. It will depend on how you write things. I think maybe in terms of thinking of it like you would structure an essay almost. You know,
Yeah.
asking a question, answering a question, asking a question, answering a question. You might not answer them one after the other, though. It might be
Right.
several chapters away or several scenes from where you asked that question. It
Right.
must be answered. And
Yes.
in general, bigger terms, you need to ask the question of what is this book about?
Yes.
How is it going to end? How are the characters going to change? And then figure out where in the book you are going to answer all of these questions.
Right.
And I think that should be your plotting process.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's one of those things where different people will approach it from different angles. They'll emphasize different methods or modes of questioning. But the more that you can answer at least a few simple questions: what does my character want? How do they plan to get it? Why do they want it? If you can answer those three questions, I have found you can probably you can rest assured that you have a decent outline, a decent plot.
And if it's a simple plot, then you
Yeah,
ask, how can this other character complicate it?
right,
Right?
exactly.
And that's how you, but don't overcomplicate it, obviously. But that's
Right,
the point of, secondary characters like the love interest or
right,
the villain's henchman or various other um, foils to your hero.
right,
Okay, but I think that's the 4 months, the first 4 months of the year we have, right?
right,
Well, that fourth month will be your plotting.
right.
And then after that, I think you're done with your preparation.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then, so as we've said, you can write that book in 3 months.
Yes.
Perhaps by that point, you've been writing every day.
Mhm.
You've built up that muscle, and it doesn't feel like such a strain to write those 1,000 words a day. And yeah, just go for it at that point. I think write it, get it done as fast as you can. Probably don't even look at it
No,
while you're doing it.
you'll succumb to tinkering.
Correct, yeah. And you'll think, oh, maybe this could be better, that could be better, and this character might need to be cut, but that's not the time for it.
No,
Finish, get to the end, write that last chapter. Then comes the worst part of writing, which is editing. And particularly editing your own work, which is
yeah,
even harder because it's dear to you, it's important and precious, and you
right.
think, oh, I can't do any wrong. It's me. It's I'm different from other authors. My work is perfect. I'd encourage anyone to work in a publication.
Right,
That notion will be dispelled very quickly.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, but the editing process doesn't need to be unpleasant.
No,
So Stephen King says, there's a closed portion of the writing process, which is your initial draft and your first edit. And he says that's after that time you open the door on your book and you
right.
give it out to other people to review. He typically will give it, I think, to his wife or a
Mhm.
friend to have a look at that point, and that's certainly the cheapest way of going about it.
Yeah,
But yeah, at that point, you might want to send the first 3 chapters off to a publisher and see what they think
right.
about it. And they will happily tell you, oh, well, we like it, but your writing style's trash, or you don't know how to write. Here's what we recommend. Fix this up and send it to us again. Or they'll just send you a rejection, right?
Yeah,
Some people say you should aim for 100 rejections a year as a prospective author. That's maybe an ambitious goal, but
that is pretty steep.
you can certainly send off that many applications, and
Right,
it gives you a chance of finding someone who thinks something that might come from your writing,
right.
which might be just what you need at that point. Some professional advice.
Yes, and openness to receive that advice is a very important part. So at this point, it seems to me the overarching takeaway is to not be precious with your work in the editing process. it is precious to you, and it is valuable regardless of what remains in the manuscript and what is mercilessly cut and thrown away and burned and forgotten. Because
yes, yeah, it's personal, and it hurts to cut that bit of
yeah.
away.
But regardless, it was still valuable because you did it. You sat down and you practiced. The way that I think of it is, it's like a sketchbook. So I have, I keep. It's kind of like Neil Gaiman's composting process, which we've discussed in the past. He essentially, if he has a bit of writing or a character or whatever that just simply does not work, he cuts it out of the document and saves it into what he calls his compost pile, another document where he can come back and revisit it, and maybe it's just the turn of phrase that he's able to reuse elsewhere, but it reminds him that that's not wasted work. That wasn't time ill spent. It was still valuable. He was still sitting down and practicing. It would be like to say that the stuff that we slash and burn was a waste.
No, I mean, it's certainly not a waste of time. It's practice.
Yeah.
And it's potentially fodder for a new book, right? Or a new story or something like that. But you need to burn it.
Yes, you
so
do.
to speak, right? You need to cut it out. You need to burn it. You need to change what you need to change.
Right.
And depending on what type of person you are, this will be the most difficult or the easiest process for you. So you might be really receptive to advice.
Yes.
It's not common, and people don't obviously like being told what's wrong with their work. But if you can make yourself open to that process, it'll be very quick and almost easy for you to make the changes you need to change and progress to your next stage, which will be the second draft,
right?
Which is a draft that is ready to be shown,
right?
And where are we? We're at 8 months, I believe.
Right.
Basically, at this point.
We're talking about a second draft.
Yeah.
At this point.
So you'll know what's wrong with your first draft.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have taken all the advice you can get, paid or unpaid, depending on your resources. And then you will go about changing everything you believe that needs to be changed. And then there's only one thing left to do, right? Is send that book out to publishers. If you are going to publish it traditionally, you can also go about self-publishing it. But I would say it's probably not ready to be published as your second draft. But
Likely
it's certainly ready to be looked at that point by other people. And maybe it's a bit misleading to say like second draft, probably more like the third time you've written it at that point, right?
Yes.
Initial write, then initial rewrite, and then you'll have a second work, so to speak, your second draft.
Right.
But yeah, this is when this is when the rejection letters start rolling in, and Absolutely. you either succeed or fail at this point, I think.
Yeah.
If
it may
if
be
there's some merit to it, at this project, there will be kind rejection letters. But perhaps some offers to resubmit with some changes.
Yeah.
That's probably the best you can hope for, unless you've done a perfect job and people are just happy enough to take it off your hands straight away.
Right.
But that's probably as far as you can go by yourself, right?
Right. Yeah. After that, there's many more people who are gonna get involved with your story.
And if you go to traditional publishing, you'll get an editor who will then coach you for what they want from you. You can obviously reject what the advice is, but then you won't be published. And if you do follow their advice, you'll get a book published and be assigned various people, to try and sell as many copies as possible.
Right.
That'll be the rest of your year at that point, probably a couple of years. This process can take up to 3 years, generally
Right.
speaking. They might want you to rework that book several times, depending on how bad it is in the first place, or what their particular vision of the book would be. And there's
Right.
if you're unhappy with it, you're probably happier not being published then, right?
Yeah.
Well, and your alternative is to self-publish.
Sure.
That's worked out for some people. And some people have become very successful of self-publication, but it's just a handful of people, really. Although some of them are quite well-known authors.
Is there somebody in particular you're thinking of?
Well, I mean, there's some sort of reprehensible people I'm thinking of.
Gotcha.
But indeed, it's not really anyone I think that respects a great deal who's gone through that process and then hasn't followed it up with going into some form of traditional publishing deal.
Right.
Because anyone who's good enough to self-publish by themselves and succeed is probably also good enough just to have gone through the traditional publishing method. And
they almost always do, following that.
Yes.
That is success. I mean, a good example would be Andy Weir. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that, his last name, but with The Martian, he self-published. Right. But he went, you want to talk about a meticulous process. I think his novel process was fascinating. But once he published it, I think it was up for only a week, self-publishing, sold for like $3.99. And within that week or 2 weeks that it was up for self-publishing, it sold, I think it was like, it was tens of thousands of copies. I think I think it was 100,000 copies. Oh wow!
By the end of whatever period it was, and I think he's still self-publishing the digital copies. It's just the physical books that are being published by someone else. I can't remember who.
Right, but he very quickly was approached by one of the big 5 publishing companies, and they said, "Hey, we would like to buy and release your book." And I think within that same period of time, was it Ridley Scott approached him as well and said, "Hey, I want to adapt this into a movie." So it was very, very, very quick.
But that's best case scenario, right?
Yeah, that is.
Don't expect that sort of.
Do not count on that.
Yeah. Especially not your first time around.
No.
But our timeline sort of gone up to the 8th month, right?
Right.
And I don't want people to feel like there's some sort of pressure to finish the novel in that time frame.
Right.
Terry Pratchett wrote 400 words a day, and he did produce a lot of books. Sometimes he's writing 2 books at a time. Right. But even if he had only written 1 book at a time, at 400 words a day, that's still 370 odd pages a year. And that's, a perfectly good amount of pages for a normal novel. That's probably perfect, right? 360 thereabouts. So it might take you longer to do that book, and it's fine. Doesn't matter. No one's going to judge you for writing a book in a longer period of time than the most successful authors in the world.
Right.
And as we said, we look at some of the other authors who don't have, a daily writing habit, and they'll spend years and years on just 1 book.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have noticed a sort of a correlation between how long it takes an author to get a book out versus, you know, how successful they tend to be. And the cutoff I've found is if it's longer than 2 years per book, that author tends to fall off. They don't tend to enjoy the same level of success consistently. Whereas the ones who can fairly consistently release books once a year or once every 2 years, those tend to be the ones that remain on the charts, who people are consistently excited about, because it is a regular product that people can expect from this person, and that you can build anticipation for that product. But if it's one of these things where it's very scattershot, where it may be, you know, 1 year for the first book, and then 4 years for the next book, and 6 for the next, it's hard to maintain an audience's interest with that sort of approach.
And there certainly are pulp fiction authors who are expected to write a book every 9 months. So,
right. Absolutely.
It always tend to be shorter books, and, you know, mostly just, you know, action-y books or romance books or something like that.
Yeah.
But don't feel bad is what I'm trying to get at with the time frame. So if it takes you a year or it takes you a year and a half, it's still fine.
Absolutely.
But there might be some correlation between success and just, you know, as much writing as you can. Obviously there is. The better, you'll be much better if you write more. And the more you write, you know, the better the books that you write will be.
Absolutely.
So I was going to say, someone like James Patterson doesn't really do a whole lot of writing per se anymore, does he? Because he has 5 or 6 ghostwriters behind him,
right,
filling out his plots. So most of what he does is plot a story, get someone like what's his name, Robotham,
right,
to you know, fill out his story and write the. Sometimes the ghostwriters say all that's contained in the chapter is the chapter number and the word twist. So I mean, if you're ever, you know, just looking at a shelf of books at the bookstore with all the James Pattersons coming out, or someone like him, just remember, you know, it's not possible for someone to write that much.
Right.
There's a team of people helping him produce.
Yes, he still does. At least
he still does his own books, yeah. But
yeah, if the name on the cover is to be trusted, he still produces at least 2 books a year. So he and Stephen King are pretty much neck and neck as far as their actual output. It's just that he also has you know, this stable of authors that he gives essentially the projects he's not as interested in, that he has plotted out or outlined, and he's just like, I'll let somebody else take this.
Yeah, no, and very quickly, if you work in a children's book environment, you might work as a collective of people producing a short series of books.
Right.
Very much like you get many directors to produce one series of television.
Sure.
You'd have a sort of series author who you know, outlines the nature of all the books, and then separate authors who write the individual stories.
Right.
For those short children's series.
It works the same way, kind of the Hollywood system for television, honestly, is there's a showrunner, you know, the person who comes up with the concept for the show, the premise for the episodes, and they give that to their writer's room, and the writers are each assigned a different episode, or I guess chapter would be or I guess book would be the analog here. And they go off, and, you know, it's this process of going back and forth between the showrunner and the different individual writers. But it's still, it's not an illegitimate way of telling a story. Probably everyone who's listening, their favorite show or movie is written this way, and even some of their favorite books. But
No,
yeah,
definitely. I mean, I can think of some books I read as a child that were made in that way that I loved, and
yeah,
certainly, you don't hate your favorite TV series just because you know it wasn't made by the same person every episode.
right.
But yeah, I think that's a good point to sort of end off on.
Yeah,
And I'd like to say, so it's certainly possible to start from scratch, start from zero, and end up with a book by the end of the year, or even somewhere in the middle of the year, if you're diligent enough.
right.
And there's no reason that this year shouldn't be the year that anyone who wants to write a book and get published didn't get published.
Well, Christopher, I'm thinking that we should. I just had a thought. What are your writing goals for this year? What are you
I
on accomplishing?
I several several days ago over recording this, I had an idea for the end of a novel, so to say.
Okay.
And I would maybe like to get that sketched out and
Yeah.
see if that's any good. That's
What,
my goal.
what's your deadline for yourself? What are you aiming for?
I would say if I don't have that done by March, it's probably not worth doing.
Okay. So, by the same token, I am now getting into my thesis in grad school. So I'm essentially producing a novel length manuscript. Um, and my goal, I have to have it done regardless, at least a single draft of it by roughly this time next year. But I'd like to
Excellent
have,
motivation.
yeah, yeah. But I'd like to have it I'm about halfway done with the actual manuscript. But I'd like to have at least two drafts gone through by the time I get to the submission standpoint. So yeah, well, I'm going to maybe bring this up and keep each other accountable, check in, and so we can maybe inspire / motivate and encourage and commiserate in the future.
That would be. I look forward to seeing your progress
There
and
you
relating mine if any happens.
go.
But I'd like to just recommend a few things on the website. So I'd recommend that people check out Write Your Novel in a Year, which is a series of 52 posts by Anthony about writing a novel in a year.
There you go.
There is What is Plot by Amanda, which details themes and sequels and all the things you need to know about planning and writing down your plot. How to write the middle of your novel, which is very important,
Yes.
also by Amanda. Then on things you can do at courses, we've got Hooked on Writing, which is available as a workbook or online. That's going to develop a writing habit over the course of 31 days. It gives you writing exercise and advice every day. You can then also look at our new prompt for 2021, divided into 12 chapters with Mia giving advice on building, writing habits and effectively developing your writing over the course of a year. It might be something to do for someone who doesn't intend to write a novel this year, but just wants to, develop their writing ability. And more than that, you can always have a look at Writer's Write, the course itself, how to write a book, which comes with some one-on-one time with authors. Particularly, I think Mia would coach you on how to actually get a novel done from beginning to end.
Excellent.
So, thank you, Oliver, for
Yeah.
talking to me today. This has been Writer's Write, Writer's Talk, and thanks everyone for listening. Ciao, until next time.
All right.